Let's now turn our attention to the structure and function of the brain. The brain is divided into several structures, each with its own specific functions. Here are some of the main structures of the brain. Number 1, the frontal lobe. This is the front part of the brain located behind the forehead. It was responsible for executive functions such as decision making, planning, problem solving, and working memory. Number 2, the temporal lobe. This is located on the sides of the brain, near the ears. It is responsible for processing auditory information, language comprehension, and memory formation. Number 3, the parietal lobe. This is located at the top and back of the brain, behind the frontal lobe. It is responsible for processing sensory information from the body, such as touch, pressure, and temperature. Number 4, the occipital lobe. This is located at the back of the brain, and it is responsible for processing visual information. Number 5, the cerebellum. This part of the brain is located at the base of the brain, under the occipital lobe. It is responsible for motor coordination, balance, and posture. Localization of function in the brain refers to the idea that different regions of the brain are responsible for different functions. Let's look at some examples of localization of function. Firstly, motor areas. The primary motor cortex, located in the frontal lobe, is responsible for the control of voluntary movement. The second, somatosensory areas. The primary somatosensory cortex, which is located in the parietal lobe, is responsible for processing touch, pressure, temperature, and pain sensations from the body. Number 3, visual areas. The primary visual cortex, located in the occipital lobe, is responsible for processing visual information. 4, auditory areas. The primary auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, and it's responsible for processing auditory information. Number 5, language areas. Broca's area, which is located in the frontal lobe, is responsible for speech production, while Wernicke's area, which is located in the temporal lobe, is responsible for language comprehension. It is important to note, however, that while certain functions are typically associated with certain regions of the brain, these regions often work together and are not entirely independent of each other. Case Study 11. Wilder Penfield was a Canadian neurosurgeon, and he conducted extensive research on the brain during the 1930s and 40s. One of his most famous studies involved the mapping of the interpretive cortex, which refers to the regions of the brain that are responsible for the interpretation of sensory information and the production of language. The aim. In Penfield's study, his aim was to use a technique known as cortical stimulation, which involved applying a small electric current to specific regions of the brain while the patient was awake and alert, to see what the physiological changes would be in the person. The method. Patients with epilepsy lay on an operating table and were conscious. A local anaesthetic was used. Penfield then stimulated different areas of the brain with electrical charges and recorded their responses. He did also treat their epilepsy. When applied to the visual area of the brain, the patient reported colours and shadows and crude outlines of objects. When applied to the somatosensory area of the brain, it produced a tingly sensation or a false sense of movement. In the temporal lobe, In either hemisphere, two different responses occurred. The first was a reliving of experiences they had had in the past. They described them as if they were living through them again, but also aware they were in the operating theatre. The second change was the interpretation of experiences, more like feelings the patients would have a sense of fear that something was coming closer or they were moving further away. Essentially, the temporal lobe was causing different forms of hallucinations. Conclusions. Penfield's research helped to confirm the idea of localization of function in the brain, which suggests that different regions of the brain are responsible for different cognitive processes. Specifically, he found that the left hemisphere of the brain was dominant for language production and comprehension in most people, while the right hemisphere was more involved in processing visual spatial information. His research also helped to identify specific areas of the brain that were associated with different functions, such as Broca's area and Wernicke's area in language processing. Weaknesses of this study are that the participants may not be indicative of the population, as we're having brain surgery for epilepsy, and as the results were different depending on the individual, may not be useful for making broad generalisations.